Good day everyone, we are Group 2 and we are assigned to discuss about the Chapter 3, Sections 4 to 6. I am Shalimi Abing and I am going to discuss about the Article 1207, including the definition of joint obligation and the effects of joint obligation. Article 1207, it states there that the concurrence of two or more creditor or of two or more debtor in one in the same obligation does not imply that each one of the former has a right to demand or that each one of the latter is bound to render entire compliance with the prestation. There is a solidarity liability only when the obligation expressly so states or when the law or nature of the obligation requires solidarity. So within that article, the very first sentence there already defines what is joint obligation. Now, joint obligation arises or exists when there are two or more creditors or there are two or more debtors. Now, the second sentence there, it states there is a solidarity liability only when the obligation expressly so states or when the law or nature of the obligation requires solidarity. Now, the second sentence there only emphasizes or reminds us about the general rule and the exceptions. When we say general rule, we must always remember this, that the obligation is presumed to be joint, not unless or except first, when the obligation expressly so provides. Second, when the law requires solidarity. And third, when the nature of the obligation requires solidarity. So let's expand our knowledge about joint obligation even more. So in joint obligation, the debt or credit is divided as many shares as there are creditors or debtors. The credit or debt being considered distinct from one another. Consequently, it is an obligation where the whole debt or credit is to be paid or fulfilled proportionately by different debtors or to be demanded proportionately by different creditors. So to understand it more clear, let's try to look at this example or illustration. Number 1, A and B are joint debtors of C to the amount of 1 million pesos. How much can C demand? So, as what I've said earlier, in joint obligation, the credit or debt is divided into as many shares as there are creditors or debtors. Now, in our example, we only have two debtors. So, ang atong 1 million, ang 1 million nga utang ni debtor A and B, we are going to divide it into 2. Therefore, C can now demand 500 pesos to debtor A. Same goes with debtor B. Now, how about if there are two or more debtors and there are two or more creditors sub? Or let's say, ang equal ang ilang number of debtors and creditors. Let's go to the example number 2. A and B are joint debtors of W, X, Y, and Z, who are joint creditors to the amount of 1 million pesos. How much can Y demand from the debtors? So, in this case, since there are 4 creditors, ang 1 million ato na siyang i-divide into 4 kay since 4 man lagi sila magbahin sa 1 million. So mahimo na siyang 250,000 na sila'y makolekt nga 250,000 pesos each. Si X, si W, X, Y, and Z. Now, ang question is how much can Y demand from the debtors? In this case, since nakita na nato nga si Y must be able to collect 250,000 at the end of the day or of this obligation, then Y can demand debtor A of the amount 125,000 pesos and same goes with debtor B, 125,000 pesos. Na if isam na nimo, makakollect na siya 250,000 pesos. So I guess it is clear in our illustrations and examples if how does a joint obligation works. So in simplest term, each creditor can recover only his share of the obligation and each of the debtor can be made to pay only his part. So there are other terms that are interchangeably used in a joint obligation. First is joint or jointly. Second is conjoint, means mancum or mancomunada. Third is mancomunada simple. Fourth is pro rata obligation. And fifth and lastly is the proportionate. So effects of joint obligation. First, the defect of each obligation arising from the personal defects of a particular joint debtor or joint creditor does not affect the obligation or the right of the other joint parties. So it simply means that personal defects does not affect other parties. So each party is still responsible for their own shares independently. Second, insolvency of one joint debtor does not make the other joint debtor or debtors responsible for his proportionate share. Insolvency does not transfer liability. So if one of the debtors goes bankrupt and is unable to pay, it doesn't mean that the other debtors has to pay for his share because again, each of the debtor is responsible only for their portion of debt. Third, the demand by the creditor or creditors on one joint debtor puts him in delay in case of non-payment while other joint debtor or debtors are not liable. So, just like the previous effect that I have mentioned, even if one of the debtors are unable to pay, the other joint debtors are not liable for it. Fourth, the defenses of one joint debtor are not necessarily available to the other joint debtors or debtor. Defenses are not shared. Even if one of the debtors has a defense, like a validity in the contract that excuses them from paying, it doesn't automatically apply to the other debtors. Each debtor has their individual defenses, so if one debtor is excused, the others are still responsible, not unless they also have their valid defenses.
So good day everyone, I'm Lugil R. Soriano and I'm going to tackle the solidary obligation. Solidary obligation is an obligation where each one of the debtor is bound to render or each one of the creditor has a right to demand entire compliance with prestation. So prestation is the payment of money or services. There are other terms interchangeably used with solidary obligations. First is the solidary obligations. It may be used interchangeably with joint and several or several. Thus, use of the term joint and solidary is confusing and ambiguous. Or you can use in solidum or mancomunada solidaria or juntos o separadamente or individually and collectively. All in all, when we say solidary obligations, it's about an obligation na yung debtor, each of the debtor is bound to render or pay their obligation. Each one of them are liable for the whole obligation. And for the creditors naman, has the right to demand the entire compliance of the obligation. So para siyang one for all for one. For instance, si B and C dito, they are the solidary debtors, while X and Y are the solidary creditors. So, their agreement is solidary, meaning it's either B or C can pay the amount or can pay the whole amount, 100,000, to either X or Y. But, it is subject to reimbursement. Kinakailangan if si B yung nagbayad ng whole amount na 100,000, kailangan yung mag-ask ng reimbursement kay C na 50,000. Kasi hindi pwedeng akuin na lang lahat ni B yung 100,000 yon. For the meantime, siguro, siya yung nagbayad ng whole amount, but kinakailangan niyang mag-ask ng reimbursement for C kasi yun yung parang share ni C sa utang nilang dalawa. The same goes with the solidary creditors, si X and Y. If si X yung nakakolekta ng whole amount na 100,000, he is obliged to give the other half to Y. Kinakailangan yung bigyan ng share si Y. So note that the obligation can be joint on the side of the debtors and solidary on the side of the creditors or vice versa. Pwedeng, kagaya ng example kanina, like si B and C, pwedeng yung side ng debtors, they can be a joint debtors. And at the same time, say X and Y, they can be solidary creditors. Pwede yon. For example, Pogi and Ganda are joint debtors to solidary creditors Luis and Bella amounting to 100,000. Since Luis and Ganda are solidary creditors, presumably he or she can collect the whole amount. But since Pogi and Ganda are joint creditors, he or she is obliged to pay the portion only of their obligation and vice versa. So, di ba, si Pogi and Ganda are joint debtors. Meaning, since joint debtors man sila, there are only portion na kinakailangan nilang bayaran, hindi yung whole amount. Siguro, sa 100,000 na yun, 50,000 kay Pogi at 50,000 kay Ganda. Kung ano man yung agreement nila. Basta merong portion lang na kinakailangan nilang bayaran. And at the same time, si Luis and Bella, they are solidary creditors. And since they are solidary creditors, they can collect the whole amount. They are entitled to collect the whole amount. So, yun yung pwede yun. Pwedeng the obligation can be joint on the side of the debtor or the side of the creditor can be solidary, that or vice versa. That's allowable. Now, let's differentiate solidary obligation versus joint obligation. So, note that in a joint obligation, each obligor answers only for a part of the whole liability. In a solidary or joint and several obligation, the relationship between the active and passive subjects is so close that each of them must comply with or demand the fulfillment of the obligation. So, a solidary obligation is one in which of the debtor is liable for the entire obligation, and each of the creditor is entitled to demand the satisfaction of the whole obligation from any or all of the debtors. On the other hand, joint obligation is one in which each debtor is liable only for a proportionate part of the debt, and the creditor is entitled to demand only proportionate part of the credit from each debtor. So, parang understandable naman siguro siya, right? Like, the very main difference among the two obligations is that ang solidary obligation, for the solidary debtors, they are liable for the whole obligation. Each debtor is liable for the whole obligation. Yung pinaka-theme kasi ng solidary obligation is that may babayaran lang, or like each of the several debtor can pay the whole obligation. Kaya nga siya parang one for all or all for one, di ba? Parang sinasagot ng isang debtor na to yung whole amount na utang nila. The rest of the debtor can pay their debt, or like yung mismong nagbayad ng utang na yon can is subject to reimbursement. Pwede siyang mag-reimburse ng money from those other debtors na hindi nakabayad. The same goes with the creditor. So, each of the creditor can demand the entire satisfaction of the whole obligation. Pwede siyang, each of those creditors can demand the satisfaction of the obligation, of the whole obligation. So, yung siguro kinakailangan lang natandaan when we say solidary obligation is that one for all for one, and it is it involves the whole obligation. Whereas in joint naman, in joint obligation, there are may portion ka lang na, let's say for the joint debtors, may portion ka lang na babayaran. For the joint creditors, they are only allowed to demand yung portion lang din nila na i-collect. May portion lang na allowable sa kanila to collect the debt. Hindi pwede yung whole na amount or yung whole na obligation yung kinakailangan nila. Kasi sa solidary yun. So, sa joint lang, always remember, there are only some, you're just only remember the word proportionate. May portion lang na kinakailangang ibayad or kinakailangang makollect, not the whole amount. So, the well-entrenched rule is that solidary obligations cannot be inferred lightly. When we say cannot be inferred lightly, meaning hindi mo siya pwedeng basta-basta na lang i-assume or basta-basta na lang mag-conclude na this situation or this agreement or this obligation is a solidary obligation. Hindi yun pwede. They must be positively and clearly expressed. A liability is solidary only when the obligation expressly so states, when the law so provides, or when the nature of the obligation so requires. Masasabi mo lang talaga siya na solidary pag meron ng ganun na mga factors. Like, kagaya ng example kanina, di ba may nakasabi na the agreement is solidary. May statement na solidary ang agreement na to. But if wala namang sinasabi na solidary ang obligation na to, you may conclude it as joint obligation but not solidary obligation. If wala. So that's all, everyone. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. This is a continuation of section 4. So I'll be discussing about the characteristic of joint indivisible obligation and the difference between indivisibility and solidarity. Let's begin with the characteristic of joint indivisible obligation. So, based on the book, there are two characteristics of joint indivisible obligation. So, first, no joint creditor can act in the representation of the other joint creditor or creditors. So, all of the creditors must make a demand for the fulfillment of the obligation. Otherwise, the debtor or the debtors may legally refuse to deliver, or he can insist that all of the creditor must receive the thing. Otherwise, he may deposit the thing by the way of consignation. So, sa first characteristic, ang motivasibo, need ko nga ang all the creditors ang make sa demand. Kay if dili ang all creditors ang make sa demand, there is possibility nga ang debtor na as your right, they refuse ang delivery, so dili mahitabo, dili na i-deliver ang thing. So, or he can insist or i-push niya nga kailangan dawaton sa creditor. Otherwise, ijang pamagi sa consignations. Next is no joint debtor can be compelled to fulfill the obligation of other joint debtors or debtors. If there are two or more joint debtors, the fulfillment of the obligation requires the concurrence of all debtors. In case of insolvency of a joint debtor, the others shall not liable for his share. So, diri asa ikaduhang characteristic. So, wa ko na obligation ang usa ka debtor na mo comply sa obligation sa usa ka debtor. To better understand, here is the example. A and B bound themselves jointly to deliver a particular car, so they are both agreed that their liabilities are joined together. Why this example is indivisible? It's because when you look at the object of the obligation, it's giving a definite thing that by nature cannot be divided. So, it means gitawag sa diyang indivisible kay hindi sa diyang matulog in the parts, or kailangan sa diyang ma-deliver as complete. So, there are need nga all of the debtors shall comply their obligations. So the question is, when the day to deliver is already arrived and they cannot deliver a particular car because B refused to comply his obligation, can A also liable for damages? So the answer is on Article 1224. It says, the debtors who may have been ready to fulfill their promises shall not contribute to the indemnity beyond the corresponding portion of the price of the thing or the value of the service in which the obligation consists. So means kay si A is ready na sa diyang mo comply or willing sa diyang mo comply sa iyong obligation, so dili sa diyang liable sa damages. On other hand, si B ang liable sa tanang damages kung nagabok at sa diyang may refuse to do his obligation. remember that this is indivisible obligation. So kay si B ning-refuse man siya to comply his obligation. So dili jud mahitabo ang ilang delivery. That's why Article 1224 says that the willing debtors shall only pay the corresponding portion. So, example. So, let's say, ang price sa ilang car nga dapat nila i-deliver is 2 million. So, kay si A is willing man siya mo comply sa iyong obligation. So, she only pay the corresponding portion. So, which is 1 million. While si B, on the other hand, is liable siya to pay the corresponding portion, which is katong 1 million plus the damages. Next is the difference between indivisibility and solidarity. So, when we say indivisibility, it refers to the prestation. So, when we say prestation, it is payment in money or in service. While solidarity, it refers to the juridical tie. So, indivisibility exists even if there is only one debtor and one creditor. So, ang pati pasabot, ang indivisibility pwede siya mahitabo if naray usa ka debtor o naray usa ka creditor. While solidarity exists only if there are two or more debtors and two or more creditors. So, means ang solidarity kuno dili siya mahitabo if usara ka debtor o usara pod ka creditor. Next, in indivisibility, each debtor is not bound to fulfill the obligation more than his share, and each creditor cannot demand fulfillment of the obligation more than his share. So, sa indivisibility kuno, si creditor by right nga mo as of fulfillment sa usa ka debtor. While in solidarity, each debtor is bound to the fulfillment or compliance of the inter-obligation, and each creditor may demand the fulfillment or compliance of the inter-obligation. So, sa solidarity, pwede si creditor na mo-ask of fulfillment sa usa ka debtor. Next, in case of breach of the obligation, the indivisible obligation is converted into indemnity for damages. Thus, the indivisible character of the obligation is terminated. So, diri as sa indivisible kay indivisible man lagi siya, so need siya nga ma-deliver as a whole. So, if dili siya ma-deliver or dili mo comply ang all debtor, so dili siya mahitabo, dili siya ma-deliver kay need man siya ma-deliver as a whole. While in solidarity, in case of breach of the obligation, the solidary character of the obligation remains. So, sa solidary moto nga pwede mo asi creditor or fulfillment ngadto sa usa ka debtor bisan pag ang usara ni refuse. In indivisibility, only the debtors guilty of breach of the obligation are liable for damages. If one debtor is insolvent, the other debtors are not liable for his share. So diri asa indivisibility o kinsa ra toy sad-an or kinsa ra toy ning refuse, mo ra to siya liable sa damages. So part and here is the example of indivisibility. So example, A obliged himself to deliver a particular car to B. So ka indivisible man siya, need ni A nga ma-deliver ang whole particular car dito ni B. So in case of breach obligation, example, si A and si B obliged themselves to deliver a particular car to C. Then si B ning refuse siya sa to do or to comply his obligation, then dili mahitabo ang ilang delivery. So kay dili man mahitabo ilang bayaran sa pinagi sa presyo. So example, ang ilang i-deliver nga car nag-worth of 2 million. So si A kay ready or willing man siya mo comply sa iyang obligation, ang iyang obligation is to pay 1 million for his part. So next is the example of solidarity. So, example, si A o si B, nangutang sila kwarta nga 20,000 nga to ni C. Then, a month after, si C ning ask or ning demand sa payment. Then, si A, nibayad siya nga to ni C og 10K for his part. So the question is, na by right si C nga moas og full payment dito ni A? The answer is yes, kay gitawag man siya solidarity. So act of one is act of all. So na-write si creditor nga moas og full payment either ni B or ni A.
Next, we are tackle about the different kind of solidarity according to source, according to the parties bound, and according to legal ties. So first, we're tackle about the solidarity according to source. So there are three solidarity according to source. First is conventional solidarity, where solidarity agreed upon by the parties. Then, legal solidarity, where solidarity is imposed by the laws. For example, Article 1822, Article 1911, Article 1915. So, mo mga examples sa solidarity na gi-impose sa law. Then, the third is real solidarity. So, where solidarity is imposed by the nature of the obligation. So those are the kinds of solidarity according to source. So next is solidarity according to parties bound. So there are three. First is the passive solidarity. Second is active solidarity. And next is mixed solidarity. So first is passive solidarity. So passive solidarity is the solidarity on the part of the debtor where one of them can be made liable for the fulfillment of the entire obligation. It is in the nature of mutual guarantee. So for example, solidarity debtor A, B, and C borrow 9,000 from D. So if there are three debtors and one creditors, muna ang passive solidarity. So either A and B and C can be made liable for fulfillment of the entire obligation. So, pwede si D nga mo-collect ni A, pwede po siya mo-collect ni B o ni C, kay tungod kay passive solidarity man siya. The next is active solidarity. So, active solidarity, solidarity on the part of the creditor where any one of them can demand the fulfillment of the entire obligation. So, for example, D borrow 9,000 from solidarity creditors A, B, and C. So, anyone from the solidarity creditors can demand the fulfillment of the entire obligation. So, either si A mo'y manukot ni D sa entire 9,000, pwede si B mo'y manukot ni D, o pwede po si C mo'y manukot ni D. So, mo na siya ang active solidarity. So, next is mixed solidarity. Solidarity on the part of the debtors and creditors where each one of the debtors is liable to render and each one of the creditor has right to demand entire compliance with the obligation. So, for example, solidarity debtors A and B borrow 9,000 from solidarity creditors C and D. So, solidarity creditor C, pwede siya mo-collect ni A, either ni A or ni B. Then, si solidarity debtors A, pwede na po siya mo-bayad either ni C o ni D. So, likewise, sila po ni B o ni D. Pwede na po sila nga, pwede si D nga mo-collect ni A and B, pwede po si B mo-bayad ni C and D. Nga na ang mixed solidarity. Next, there are different kind of solidarity according to the legal tie. So there are two, uniform and non-uniform varied. So first is uniform, when the parties are bounded by the same stipulation or manner. Ang non-uniform or varied, when the parties are not subject to the same stipulation manner. So for example, A, B, C, solidarity debtors borrow 9,000 from D. So, na sila gisabutan nga, ag si A mo install og 1,000 starting July. Ag B pod, mubayad siya in December, ijang June. Ag si C, mubayad po siya in December. So, ag kanay sila, dili ni siya uniform, kundi non-uniform varied. Mo to example sa non-uniform varied and uniform varied. So next, we will tackle about the effect of demand against one of the solidarity debtors. When a demand is made against one solidarity debtors, it affects all the other solidarity debtors, meaning that the creditor can still pursue collecting from any one of the debtors even if initially demanded payment from only one. Then, however, once the debt is fully paid by one of the solidarity debtors, the obligation is extinguished and no further demands can be made against the others. So, for example, nangutang sila si A ug solidarity debtors A, B, and C nangutang ni D. So, ag si A mubayad na gani si ni D, it means ag si creditors dili na si mo dili na si manukot ni B ug ni C kay gibayran naman ni A. So, motoy effect demands against one solidarity debtors. So, overall sa ang isulti na atoy tulo ka key points. So, first, any debtors can be pursued. Second, demand on one, affect all. Third, no double payment. Ito ang overall nga point sa akong isulti sa effect on the demand against one solidarity debtors. Thank you.
Effect of payment by a solidarity debtor. Payment, which means not only the delivery of money but also the performance in any other manner of the obligation, is the operative fact which will entitle either of the solidarity debtors to seek reimbursement from the share which corresponds to each of the debtors. Payment by one of the solidarity debtor extinguishes the obligation. A debt shall not be understood to have been paid unless the thing or service in which the obligation consists has been completely delivered or rendered, as the case may be. If two or more solidarity debtors offer to pay, the creditor may choose which offer to accept. A solidarity debtor who made the payment may claim from his co-debtors only the share which corresponds to each, with the interest for the payment already made. If the payment is made before the debt is due, no interest from the intervening period may be demanded. So, for example, X, Y, and Z solidarily oblige themselves to pay 450,000 pesos to B on December 31, 2020. If Z offered to pay and thereafter paid the 450,000, the obligation is extinguished and Z can thereafter ask for reimbursement from X and Y, their share in the obligation, which is 150,000 pesos each. What if on due date, both X and Y are offering to pay the entire amount of the obligation? Then B, the creditor, can choose which offer to accept. Thereafter, the obligation is extinguished. Then also, what if X paid the total obligation on October 31, 2020? Again, the obligation is extinguished. Consequently, X can demand the share of Y and Z in the amount of 150,000 pesos each. X cannot demand for interest because the debt was paid before it is due, but he can demand 3 months interest if he paid on December 31, 2020, and thereafter, Y and Z reimbursed him on March 31, 2021. So, what if after X paid the obligation, Z also became insolvent on due date? Then X and Y will share in the obligation of Z proportionately, and that is 75,000 pesos, which is 150,000 pesos is divided by 2. So, because they will absorb his share. Therefore, X will ask reimbursement from Y the amount of 225,000 pesos, which is
The original is 150,000 pesos share and the 75,000 pesos share.
Let's talk about what is the surety contract. So, surety contract it refers to an agreement where under one person, the surety engaged to be answerable for the debt default or miscarriage of another known as the principal. So, there are three parties involved. First is the principal or the debtor, second is the obligee or the creditor, and third is the surety or the guarantor. A suretyship contract is considered an accessory contract, meaning it is dependent on the existence of the primary contract between the principal and the obligee. The surety's liability is only triggered if the principal fails to fulfill their obligation. If the surety pays the debt on behalf of the principal, you have the right to pursue legal actions against the principal to recover the funds paid. Example, if a company wants to lease a building, the landlord may ask the company owner to provide the personal guarantee, ensuring that rent payments are made even if the company's default.
Good day. So today I will explain the difference between the solidarity versus the surety in obligation and contracts. So first, solidarity. This happens when two or more people are equally responsible for an obligation. If one debtor fails to pay, the creditor can demand full payment from any of the co-debtors. For example, Anna and Ben, Carl takes a loan as solidary debtors. If Anna cannot pay, the creditor can demand full payment from Ben or Carl. Now, surety. This is when a person called a surety guarantees the payment of the debtor. However, the surety is only liable if the debtor fails to fulfill the obligation. For instance, Jake takes a loan and Lisa signs as his surety. If Jake doesn't pay, Lisa will be responsible for the debt. In solidarity, all debtors share equal responsibility. In surety, the surety only pays if the principal debtor fails.
Let's talk about the prescription. So, prescription is one that acquires ownership and other real rights through the lapse of time in the manner and under the conditions laid down by the law. In the same way, rights and conditions are lost by prescription. Also, actions prescribed by the mere lapse of time fixed by the law. There are the following articles are the pertinent rules on prescription of actions. So first, actions to recover movables shall prescribe 8 years from the times the possession thereof is lost, unless the possessor has acquired the ownership by prescription for a least period. Example, if Maria lost possession of her bicycle, she has 8 years to recover it. If she does not act within this time frame, her right to reclaim the bicycle may be extinguished unless someone else has acquired ownership through a shorter period of possession. Second is real actions over immovables prescribed after 30 years. In example, if John has been living on a piece of land for 30 years without any challenge from the actual owner, he may claim ownership of that land through prescription, as real actions over immovables prescribed after 30 years. Next is a mortgage action prescribed after 10 years. So, in example, a bank has a mortgage claim against a property. If the bank does not take action to enforce this claim within 10 years, it may lose the right to collect the debt due to the prescription of the mortgage action. And fourth, right not extinguished by prescription. So, if a neighbor has been blocking access to a right-of-way, the affected party can bring an action to demand the right-of-way at any time,
as the right is not extinguished by prescription. Next is, and last is actions on written contracts. If a party has a written contract that has not been fulfilled, they must bring an action within 10 years from the time the right of action occurs. For instance, if a contractor fails to complete work as agreed, the client has 10 years to show for breach of contract.
Defenses available to a solidary debtor. Number 1 is defenses derived from the nature of the obligation. This is a total defense, thus all the solidary co-debtors are benefited. Examples are payment or performance, lack of cause or consideration, condonation, prescription, and in cases of absolutely simulated contract. Number 2 is defenses which are personal to him or pertain to his own share. This constitutes total defense and partial defense. Examples of the former are minority, insanity, fraud, mistake, violence, and intimidation, while examples for the latter are non-fulfillment of a suspensive condition and non-arrival of a suspensive period. So we have here example. In a contract, X and Y are the solidary debtors of B in the amount of 10,000 pesos. When B made a demand from X, the latter raised his defense of insanity at the time of the perfection of the contract. If this is true, then X is not liable. As to X, this is a complete defense. Next is number 3, defenses which are personal to other solidary co-debtors. A solidary debtor may avail himself only as regards the part of the debt for which the other solidary co-debtors are responsible. For example, in a contract, X and Y are the solidary debtors of B in the amount of 10,000 pesos. When B made a demand from Y, the latter raised his defense of insanity of X at the time of the perfection of the contract. If this is true, then Y is liable only for 5,000 pesos, his share in the obligation. As to Y, this is a partial defense. Hence, he is not liable for the share of X amounting of 5,000 pesos.
So, hi everyone, this is Section 5, Chapter 3, Section 5A. This Section 5, as nasa book, is the divisible and indivisible obligations. So, Article 1, 2, 2, 3, the divisibility or indivisibility of the things that are the object of obligations in which there is only one debtor and only one creditor does not alter or modify the provisions of Chapter 2 of this title. So, in Section 5, I'm going to discuss the divisible obligations and the indivisible obligation, as well as what is the divisible thing and indivisible thing. Okay, so let's start with divisible obligation. So, when we say divisible obligations, imagine you're having a contract to paint a house in 3 stages. First is the exterior, followed by the interior walls, and finally the trim. So, the performance can be broken down into distinct parts. So, each performance have a different value. So, the payment is pwede mahimo ang payment after ma-complete na ang each nga performance. So, for example, we have the exterior. If mahuman na ang exterior, you can pay or makuha na nimo ang payment inana. Followed by the interior, pwede na ka mubayad if ma-kompleto na siya nga part. So, as well as for the trim. So, that is divisible obligations. Pwede nimo siya ma-broken down into distinct parts. So now, on the other hand, we have the indivisible obligation. So for the indivisible obligation, think of a specific piece of artwork. So the contract, ana, is to deliver the unique piece or the specific piece. You can't receive half of the painting or half of the piece, and you can't pay half of the price. It's all or nothing. You will the performance is single and complete. So dapat dili ka pwede maka-receive ra og half ra inana, like okay, straight to the point, dili siya pwede kanang ma-broken down into kuan. Dapat complete ang imuha nga ma-receive. So understanding this distinction is crucial in contract law because it affects on how you determine the breach of contract, calculate the damages, and enforce agreements. So remember, divisible obligation is, or the things can be broken down into parts, while the indivisible obligation is a complete and single performance. So now that we are done defining divisible obligation and indivisible obligations, let's dive into divisible things and indivisible things. So when we say divisible things, these are things that can be broken down into distinct parts. So let's think for example, a bag of rice. So a bag of rice can be easily divided into smaller portion, and each portion still retains the value as rice. So that's the divisible things. So on the other hand, indivisible thing is, these are the things or petitions that cannot be divided without destroying or altering their essence. So for example, you have a painting. You cannot cut it in half and still have the same artwork. Indivisible things is single and complete piece. So the key difference lies on the nature of the object itself. So when we say divisible things, those are the things that can be broken down into parts without affecting their value. While the indivisible thing, on the other hand, is it is a complete piece and cannot be divided without losing their essential nature. So those are the differences of the two. So as the continuation of the divisible obligations and indivisible obligations, we are now at the kinds of divisions. So there are three kinds of divisions. First is quantitative, second is qualitative, and third is the ideal or intellectual division. So the first type of division is the quantitative division. So this type of division focuses on the quantity of the object. So when we say quantity, there are numbers involved, like 1, 10, or even 1,000. An example for this is the division of the hectare, a 1,000 hectare piece of land. So this 1,000 hectare piece of land can be divided into smaller portions based on their size. The second division is the qualitative division. This division is based on the quality of the object, but not on the quantity. So an example of the qualitative division is the division of an inheritance. So that includes real property, which is the land, and then the personal property, which is the jewelry. So these items are qualitatively different and can be divided based on their specific characteristic. So, maingon nga, ang kaning kuan juta para ni sa katong sa ahong usa ka anak, and then ang kaning jewelry is para pud sa lain na ahong anak. The third kind of division is the intellectual or ideal division. So when we say ideal or intellectual, there is a meeting of the minds between two parties, and then this division is kuan kanang this division exists only in the minds of two parties. So let's say the two people inherit a car together. So they are co-owners, and then the car itself isn't physically divided. So their ownership is divided conceptually or ideally or
and not materially. So understanding this kind of division is crucial because it helps us determine whether an obligation can be performed in parts or needs to be completed as whole. So this has implications for how the obligation is fulfilled and what happens if one party fails to perform their part. So we've already discussed divisible and indivisible obligations. Remember, a truly indivisible obligation is one that cannot be performed in parts. But what about obligations that could be divided but are legally treated as indivisible? So that's what we'll explore today. An obligation is deemed indivisible under these circumstances. First is by its nature. If the object of the obligation is inherently indivisible, like painting a portrait or delivering a specific item, it's considered indivisible. It is regardless of what the party agrees. So the second is circumstances is by the stipulation. So even if the object could be divided, the parties can explicitly agree in their contract that the obligation will be treated as indivisible. So this is a matter of their agreement. The third circumstances is by the provision of law. So these certain obligations are declared indivisible by specific laws. These are usually obligations involving public interest or particular social context. So one example of obligations deemed indivisible, as the book says, is the obligation of X to give his only laptop to Y, and then the obligation of X to conduct a one-day lecture on obligations and contracts. So these are the definite things, or when you say definite, there is a specific.
So good day, my name is Samkelel Tirante and I will be discussing about Article 1226, which is about obligations with penal clause. So in Article 1226, in obligations with a penal clause, the penalty shall substitute the indemnity for damages in the payment of interest in case of non-compliance. If there is no stipulation to the contrary, nevertheless, damages shall be paid if the obligor refuses to pay the penalty or is guilty of fraud in the fulfillment of obligations. And according to Article 1152, the penalty may be enforced only when it is defendable in accordance with the provisions of this code. So what is obligation with penal clause? An obligation with penal clause is with an accessory undertaking by virtue of which the obligor assumes a greater liability in case of breach of the obligation. It functions to strengthen the coercive force of the obligation and to provide, in effect, for what could be the liquidated damages resulting from such a breach. So what is penal clause? Penal clause is an accessory undertaking to assume greater liability in case of breach and is attached to an obligation in order to secure its performance. The penalty shall substitute the indemnity for damages and payment of interest in case of non-compliance. But if such stipulation is found contrary to law for being usurious, it can be nullified by the courts without the affecting the principal obligation. So basically, a penal clause is a rule in a contract that says if someone fails to do their obligation, they must pay a penalty or face consequences. So what are the purposes of penal clause? One, it is attached to an obligation in order to ensure performance. And two, the penalty shall substitute the indemnity for damages in the payments of interest in case of non-compliance.
Good day everyone, I am Elisha Nkisit and I will be discussing my topic, which is penalty may be reduced by the courts. So first is when the principal obligation has been partly complied with by the debtor. Then second is when the principal obligation has been irregularly complied with by the debtor. Then third is if the penalty is iniquitous or unconscionable. So as a general rule, courts are not at liberty to ignore the freedom of the parties to agree on such terms and conditions as they see fit, as long as they are not contrary to law, morals, good customs, public orders, or public policy. So nevertheless, courts may be equitably reduce a stipulated penalty in the contract in two instances. As I said earlier, First is if the principal obligation has been partly or irregularly complied. Then second is even if there has been no compliance, if the penalty is iniquitous or unconscionable. So in Legutin v. Court of Appeals, the Supreme Court pointed out that the question of whether a penalty is reasonable or iniquitous can be partly subjective and partly objective, as its resolution would depend on such factors as but not necessarily confined to the type, extent, and purpose of the penalty, the nature of the obligation, the mode of breach and its consequences, the supervening realities, the standing and relationship of the parties, and the like, the application of which by and large is addressed to the sound discretion of the court. So the problem or the example is, for example, X and Y obtained on May 11, 1981, a loan in the amount of 120,000 from Z Bank. X and Y executed a promissory note binding themselves jointly and severally to pay the sum borrowed with an interest of 15.189% per annum upon maturity, and to pay a penalty of 5% every month on the outstanding principal and interest in case of default. So the obligations matured on September 8, 1981. The bank, however, granted an extension but only up until December 29, 1981. So despite several demands from the bank, X and Y failed to settle the debt, which as of May 20, 1982 amounted to 114,416.10 centavos. On September 30, 1982, the bank sent a final demand letter to X and Y informing them that they have 5 days within which to make full payment. Since X and Y still defaulted on their obligations, the bank filed on November 3, 1982, a complaint for recovery of the due amount. So the question is the penalty reasonable or iniquitous? So the answer is the question of whether a penalty is reasonable or iniquitous can be partly subjective and partly objective. Its resolution would depend on such factors as but not necessarily confined to the type, extent, and the purpose of the penalty, the nature of the obligation, the mode of breach and its consequences, the supervening realities, the standing and relationship of the parties, and the like, the application of which by and large is addressed to the sound discretion of the court. In Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation versus Court of Appeals, just an example, the court has tempered the penalty charges after taking into account the debtor's pitiful situation and its offer to settle the entire obligation with the creditor bank. The stipulated penalty might likewise be reduced when a partial or irregular performance is made by the debtor. The stipulated penalty might even be deleted, such as when there has been substantial performance in good faith by the obligor, when the penalty clause itself suffers from fatal infirmity, or when exceptional circumstances so exist as to warrant it. So the Court of Appeals, exercising its good judgment in instant case, has reduced the penalty interest from 5% a month to 3% a month, which petitioner still disputes. Given the circumstances, not to mention the repeated acts of breach by petitioner of their contractual obligation, the court sees no cogent ground to modify the ruling of the appellate court. So, Ananda stipulated interest of 15.189% per annum. The interest stipulation on its face does not appear as being that excessive. The essence or rationale for the payment of interest, quite often referred to as cost of money, is not exactly the same as that of a surcharge or a penalty. A penalty stipulation is not necessarily preclusive of interest if there is an agreement to that effect, the two being distinct concepts which may separately be demanded. So in Article 1230 or 1230, the nullity of the penal clause does not carry with it that of the principal obligation. The nullity of the principal obligation carries with it that of the penal clause 1155. Effect of nullity of the penal clause. The nullity of the penal clause does not carry with it that of the principal obligation. So the effect of nullity of the principal obligation is the nullity of the principal obligation carries with it that of the penal clause, because the penalty is merely an accessory obligation. Consequently, if the principal obligation is null and void, then penal clause is also null and void. The principle is that accessory follows the principle. Example, X promised to pay 50,000 to Y on December 31, 2023. Then, as an additional stipulation, they agreed that X will be liable to deliver 1 kilogram of illegal drugs as a penalty in case of failure to deliver his obligation on maturity date. The obligation to pay 50,000 is valid, however, the penalty is void, meaning as if it did not exist from the very beginning. Thus, only the penalty is disregarded. What if X promised to deliver 1 kilogram of illegal drugs to Y on December 31, 2023? As an additional stipulation, they agreed that X will be liable to pay 50,000 as penalty in case of failure to deliver his obligation on maturity date. So the entire obligation is void.
Thank you for watching.